What was your relationship with Edison Denisov?
When I went to study at Moscow, I became friendly with young composers there who were at the Moscow Conservatoire, especially one Sergei Zhukov. And these composers introduced me to Denisov. Denisov actually did not teach composition at Moscow Conservatory at that time. You know, the important composers never taught composition at the Moscow Conservatory. That's you know, you had people like Khrenikov who were just party hacks, in fact. But anyway, but Denisov did teach. I think he taught orchestration maybe and some other. But Denisov was a kind of conduit, I should say, for bringing music from the West to the Soviet Union. So his apartment, he had connections in the West, and he would score somehow. He received sometimes recordings of, you know, at that time, pieces from Stockhausen, et cetera, and the young composers and musicians would go to his house. They would listen to this and discuss the things. In any case, when I was studying in Moscow, I became involved in new music there. And it started out with the first work that I played of Denisov was his Ode, which was for clarinet, percussion, and piano. I played that. And from playing that piece for Denisov and in the concert, we also became very good friends. And Ode is a fantastic piece. And the original version of that piece moved to a section which was improvisation. But in order to have it published somehow, he wrote out a version of this improvisation. But his original conception of it, going to this improvisation, where everything sort of breaks apart in a very dramatic and aggressive way, and then sort of stops all of a sudden with this. Then you have this gong, and then the coda come in, is much, much more dramatically effective than what is published, actually, like that. So I was actually surprised about what was in fact published this way. And after this, soon after I played that piece, he gave me a manuscript copy, his sonata. There's 1971, I guess, 72, 71 now. I forget exactly what the year was when he wrote it. And then I played it 1975 in Moscow. And played it for him several times. And he explained much about how he wrote, etc. with this piece. And I do think that a lot of the fact that piece has become quite standard for clarinet comes from the fact that I've performed it so many times since then, throughout the world. What is published, at least in the West, there was a Soviet publication of that work, which is correct. But what is published in the West, it was first by Gehrig, I think, was the publisher, and then it's been taken over maybe by Breitkopf. It has significant mistakes. And I hear this, people play, and they don't know that they're mistakes, and I hear them with mistakes, and I cringe. But unfortunately, I mean, if you actually look at the piece is written in a very structural way. You can actually tell that they're mistakes, you see. But but anyway, I've written several times about these mistakes, given sort of examples, but I feel badly that somehow they haven't gone into the clarinet world. You know, also, you know, the Gra has some mistakes, which they're not mistakes of notes, but mistakes of dynamics, little mistakes, which include, plus the multiphonic fingerings, which are wrong in the published version. And Clarinet Concerto, also in its published version, has some very important mistakes in the orchestral parts, orchestral score as well, and a little bit in the clarinet as well. For the music of Carter, I wrote to the publisher Boosey and Hawkes about they didn't do anything. So this is the Denisov. Then when I left the Soviet Union, and then I came back, I left in 1978, I came back 1980 and played concerts, and And then he had then left and was living in France. We lived in Germany, and he was the victim of a terrible traffic accident and was spent years in the hospital. And I sort of lost touch with him during that time. And he had promised a clarinet concerto for me, but instead it was actually Edward Brunner, who knew Denisov well. Also, he was able to get together the funding for it, and so it was basically written for him. But what was nice is that that he sent me a manuscript copy of the concerto, which I must say that I haven't played yet. I looked it up. I practiced it, but I was not able to find an orchestra to play that work. But I still have it in mind to do. And then Denisov then did send me a piece which he did write for me, which is it's titled "Reflections of the Moon on the Lake," which is very beautiful work.
What's your opinion about publishers?
Now I have to speak briefly a little bit more about Boosey and Hawkes. I mentioned how they didn't correct the Carter Graph, for instance, the things that should have been corrected there. Now, Copland, when he wrote his concerto, he originally wrote a version which was too difficult for Benny Goodman. He showed it to Benny Goodman. This is all in his autobiography, which was written, sort of dictated to Vivian Perlis. There's a part of a chapter about the concerto, and that even has a page from his early piano manuscript of this, where he writes, "This is too difficult for Benny Goodman." He wanted to show the world that he had written something too difficult for. Now, this was all the way back in 1990 to start. I saw this. I was in fact introduced this. I always want to give credit where credit is due to a wonderful student of mine whose name was Michael Lowenstern, who's one of the really great bass clarinetists in the world. And he's probably known to many people because he's very active on the internet. But in any case, he showed me this part of the, and that sparked my interest. So the first thing I did, I spoke with the person who was the head of, at that time, of the Copland Foundation, whose name was Jacob Druckmann, and so also a fascinating composer, and to get permission to reconstruct the original version. And I went to the Library of Congress, and I did a lot of research, et cetera, and I did a reconstruction. Now that reconstruction, when 2000, this was supposed to be the 100th year of Copland's birth, celebration, was supposed to be published at that time by Boosey and Hawkes. And I gave them all the material, and somehow they lost it, and they didn't publish it, et cetera, et cetera. Then they came out several years later, and they have this newer publication, including what they say are what they call osias from 1948. Now, they are wrong. This is an edition which I say is criminally wrong, in fact, in our little world of clarinet music. And all I should say about it now, because to explain in detail would take a lot of time, but the problem is that first of all, they didn't ask me again, even though I had already recorded the work. I had the reconstruction with the early permission from the Copland Foundation and from the estate of Benny Goodman. I had both of them. And I should actually mention, did a little detour, when Benny Goodman looked at it and said that this is too difficult, I have to understand that it's not that he was lazy or anything of that sort. I think in 1948, to look at what Copland had written, first of all in D major for the clarinet, which is not the most gratifying key to play in any case, and then to have these notes which are really in the stratosphere, and this whole section at the end, which is so high up and very virtuosic. I think anybody looking at that time would say, are you kidding? This is not for the clarinet. And even now, to really play that ending takes quite something. It's quite, as he wrote it. The problem with Boosey and Hawkes is they were very lazy. Publishers are often very lazy. They just, the Library of Congress had on microfilm, and they put that online, a certain bit of the Copland archive, you see. But that was not the final word in terms of the concerto. That was not the final word of what he wrote. So they have this early pencil sketch, for instance, there, and not even in total. They have it there. So they just looked at that and then took one thing from a statement that from the autobiography that there was one high note. In fact, there were two in the cadenza, not only one. You see, the thing is that aside from that, there's a whole archive folio of this archive of the concerto. You see, which is not on microfilm, not online. You see, and if you look there, you find things like the clarinet part, which he had shown to Benny Goodman, and there you see very clearly everything that was erased. And you see that his solutions were very perfunctory. Like these one thing, something's down a third, which you could do if you're a particular chord. You can put it up with the fifth of the chord or down to the third of the chord or whatever. You see, so it was that's what he did very, very, I would say, probably very quickly, in fact. And you even see in that, you see a bit online of that he was even prepared for the end pages in B flat, which would be for us in C major, because he thought maybe that would be a little easier, but ended up not doing that. And instead taking what was originally the end clarinet part and putting it in the piano. And then you had in the piano score, you have it sketched in pencil, the revised clarinet part. And I'm not an expert in handwriting, so I cannot make a real judgment call about this. But the handwriting does look a little bit different. So I would wonder if maybe what was sketched in there was sketched by Benny Goodman. It's a possibility in the end of that last part of the piece. But in any case, I'd done all this research and got it done. And then Boosey Hawkes comes out with something which is ridiculous. So these are publishers. Now, we also have different things, like for instance, Barenreiter, and you have these two note changes in the first movement of the Mozart concerto. And you do have also different things in terms of articulation. And there is a manuscript fragment, which is 199 measures, which is complete enough that we can see everything that Mozart intended. These two changes in notes in the passage, one is an F natural, the other is a B flat. In Barenreiter, they're written as maybe possibilities, but these are not possibilities. These are absolutely necessary because they come from the language of music. So that, for instance, in the first one, since Mozart is going to F sharp minor, Fis-Moll, you do not want to have what would be a D sharp concert going in the descending verse. You need a D natural, which is an F natural for the A clarinet, you see. But it's in the standard version, it's not written as a natural. So, and then going back, there's no manuscript, but that doesn't mean that the language of music all of a sudden was different. You see, the tonal language of music at the time, let's say. So you need, again, a G natural as you're going to D minor, rather than D sharp, or it's a G sharp. That's I'm saying. So it's a B. So you need B flat rather than B natural for the clarinet. And that's simply, if you listen carefully, you'll see that if you play without those changes, it sounds wrong. And this is something that you take into, you're in elementary school and you'd have your very first year of harmony class. Even you're just 10 years old and you're doing it. You take it into your teacher and the teacher says, "I'm sorry, but this is a mistake." And for more than 200 years, clarinet players and conductors, I should say, have been playing with these mistakes. I think that's embarrassing. Anyway, there are a lot more about publishers and I have to mention actually just a little more. This has to do with my own embarrassment. And that is that I have a Rossini version that I edit of the Rossini introduction, theme, and variations. And there are a couple of note mistakes in the clarinet part there. Yeah, and I feel very embarrassed about that. And then also in my latest publication of Brahms clarinet sonatas in the E flat, there are a couple mistakes, clarinet mistakes. And this is a different issue, but it's also a serious issue. This has to do with the fact that if we're doing something, we need to have someone else who is a very diligent editor. So in all of these, I spent a lot of time with the piano doing that. The clarinet part I knew too well. So I would look at it and I would not see the couple mistakes that were there. But when I was doing the editing, I did not have the kind of editor who was able to look at this and point out these kinds of mistakes. If you're writing a novel, you have an editor who goes, or you write scientific paper, you're vetted by many different editors. But here I was, so I apologize for these mistakes. And I haven't organized my website well, but I will mention all the corrections that I've found. There are just a couple notes, but I shudder when I think about this moment. So I think that's everything I want to say about publishing.